Welcome everybody, and thank you for introducing yourself and where you're from. We'd like to take advantage of the chat function in this webinar. So as we go through, if you have questions or comments, please put those in the chat box. We will allot time at the end of the presentation to take formal questions and answers. Could you advance the slides, Howard? Excuse me, Cliff.
There we go.
So just to give you a quick overview of today's webinar, we want to start from the idea that agility for most organizations is not being met to the goal. And we want to share some reasons why we think that is and how to overcome them. We also want to promote a new idea that agility is not necessarily something that comes from process. It comes from behavior, it comes from culture, it comes from communication and conversations. And we'll present an example of this. And we'll look also at what actually leads to agility and spend some time really looking at how all these elements relate together. And then we're going to share with you a new surefire approach for achieving agility. Can you advance the slide? So I want to suggest that when Agile was first established in 2001, the Agile Manifesto came out in February, but the world has significantly changed in the last 21 years. Just think about these four areas. Computer technology has exploded. Computing power continues to follow Moore's law and has grown rapidly. But we've seen new things that have come up that didn't exist when agility, the Agile Manifesto came out. The cloud, big data, cognitive systems, artificial intelligence, machine learning, low-code software, mobile apps. And if you think about it, software is in just about almost everything. So huge change in computer technology, but also big changes in communication technology. In 2001, we did have cell phones, but we didn't have smartphones. And now, if you think about it, most business communication occurs over the internet. And mobile data has become very high bandwidth. Mobile plans now are much cheaper. They work globally. We have social media that didn't exist in 2001. And now we have these virtual meeting platforms like Zoom and others. If we look at the marketplace, I think it's one that's really characterized now by disruption and volatility, complexity. And we've moved away from a national economy to a global economy. We've implemented just-in-time supply chains, e-commerce, and it's also being influenced by climate change and pandemics. And finally, think about the workplace. You know, just after the Agile Manifesto came out, we had 9/11. And think about what 9/11 has done to work environments and travel or in employee privacy and security. We've also seen a significant revolution in careers and the social contract between organizations and their employees. We've seen massive changes in jobs that have been eliminated and new jobs that have been created. We have a gig economy for many people. Organizational culture has been dramatically turned around. And if you think about the work environments, just look what's happened to where we work, how we work based on the pandemic. And we're beginning to see more global teams, more asynchronous communication. So if you really put all of this together, we've had just monumental, significant, foundational change in our culture and our work environments. Next slide, please, Cliff. So why constructive agility? If you think about these ideas, all of these things going on, we need to have a better form of being agile. Next slide, Cliff. So I want to ask you a question, and if you could share this in chat. What issues have you had to deal with within your organizations based on the pandemic and all these other changes that we've talked about? And now I'm going to turn it over to Cliff.
Thank you, Stephen. Finally, the tech's working. It's like half the time things work and half the time they don't work. Anyway, things have become too complicated for all the reasons Stephen said. So please put in the chat, and Stephen and Howard are going to look at the chat and then, bring those issues to the fore as, if people share things in order to discuss them. I want to go forward while we're doing that and, look at how, Agile kind of has not met the need. If we go back a second, organizations need agility, for many reasons. And the need is more acute than it was 20 years ago. Things are changing more quickly. There's more diversity in how people work and communicate. And today products are more complicated. It's very common that products intersect, that they share components, and change has to happen quickly. During the pandemic, the companies that flourished were the ones who could quickly change suppliers when they had supply chain issues, and quickly were able to jump into alternative products and alternative, customer behavior changed, consumer behavior changed, and companies that did well could quickly change. So agility is very important today. It's becoming more important. But, the Agile movement, if you will, which began in IT, around 2000 or so, kind of has not really been up to the task. Organizations seem to be very challenged in using those ideas and having it actually work for them. And so we can go on and on about why that is and so on, but the whole point of Agile 2 is to kind of revisit that and rethink it and be smarter about it. So instead of coming up with something on a ski weekend, which is how the Agile Manifesto was created, we spent a long time, 15 people spent a long time thinking about it. And we created a team with the diverse skill sets needed to really tackle that. And the first thing we did is a retrospective, so it's an attempt to be smarter and to use science and research about communication and behavioral psychology and leadership theory and so on. So without throwing Agile out, we kind of want to sharpen it, and that's what Agile 2 is about. And those of you who are familiar with Agile 2. Because the original Agile was profound, but it was kind of a little off target. It wasn't quite right, and it was too simplistic. You can't run organizations based on a set of bumper stickers, which is essentially what the Agile Manifesto is. You need kind of rich understanding of those issues. These are complex human issues. So you really have to look at like leadership theory and cognitive science and culture and understand these things. These are deep subjects. There's no shortcut. So Agile 2 was about and is about those things. But we also realize that Agile 2 is mostly about behavior. Culture is an important element too. So what we developed, constructive agility, tries to bring in the culture component, and so it really encompasses a lot of what we've learned as a profession about leadership theory. There are a lot of models of leadership that have been deeply studied and researched, and behavioral science. How do people work together in groups? What are the behavioral dynamics? And operations research, which happens to be one of my degrees in operations research. So I tend to look at it through that lens. And, so we look at it, in terms of flow and DevOps and theory of constraints, and risk management, those are all aspects of an operational research or systems view, which is a really important kind of view to take. And then the cognitive science, how do people communicate? How do people create and think? Not everybody's the same. So advice like the best communications face-to-face, well, it depends. Sometimes, but not always. Scientific teams usually collaborate remotely in writing, but a lot of times they do communicate face-to-face. It depends. That's the thing. So that's what we need to do. We need to be smarter about these things. These aren't simple issues. There is no silver bullet. And so, given that, do we really think that something like this will make us agile? Just following a set of steps or a script or, someone's process spec and role definitions, that won't make you agile. It won't. It really won't. I stake my profession on it. It's not that it will hurt necessarily. It might even help in some ways. It might help or hinder, depending. Because really you need minimum process, not zero process. You need minimum for what you're doing, but it won't make you agile. And so what is agile? Well, here's what actual agility looks like in a complex product development environment, where you have a company that has lots of different things that they make. And those things are complex and they share components and there are lots of teams and there's a lot going on. So imagine a situation where some teams are working and then an unexpected issue arises. And guess what? That's normal. That happens like all the time. That's not an anomaly. That's the normal case. So something comes up that's unplanned for, and something should work but doesn't, and then they realize, that's never going to work the way we're doing it. We need to change something, and the issue in this case cuts across, impacts many teams. Maybe it's an issue with a shared component, and they realize we need to change that component. Maybe that component is a core microservice used by lots of products. Maybe the component is an engine used in lots of different kinds of machine products. The issue is it's something that needs to change that will affect lots of different groups. What do you do? What do you do? Well, if we look at a very process-driven organization, like say they use SAFe, and for those who don't know, that's the Scaled Agile Framework, which is a very popular so-called Agile scaling framework. And this is not to pick on SAFe. This is really to look at an approach that's very process-centric, which SAFe is. So this is not unique to SAFe. This is about process-driven methodologies. So what might happen is, you realize, we need to change that core microservice because, it doesn't support the kind of stuff that we need from it. But there are lots of other products that use that. If we change that, we'll break those. So what do we do? Well, in the SAFe approach, if you follow the process, and some organizations that use SAFe actually are run well and people will go outside the process. So, but if you just follow the process, what you would do is you would wait for the next planning increment, which might be many, many weeks away. And so a lot of time would pass. But what really needs to happen, and this is what agility looks like, what really needs to happen is you let people know, hey, there's a problem. I need to actually go talk to some of those other teams and see what they think. And also, I need to let our team lead know, maybe the product lead, because they have a broader view. They might say, also, you need to talk to these other teams. And also, we need to bring in the architect or something, So the key is to get the right people, the right brains, and the right decision makers together. And no more than that. Don't get everyone together, because then you bring everything to a halt unnecessarily. So someone or someones need to decide who needs to be in the conversation and start the conversation. And it needs to be a high quality, effective, dialectic conversation, issue focused, where the best idea wins and you go deep and you talk about the actual issue and don't skid around and you don't try and bargain, but you actually talk about what's best overall. And then decide and do that quickly. So if it's like, oh, we talked about it for half an hour, we need to get back to our jobs, we'll pick that up next week. That's a non-starter too. It needs to be driven to resolution aggressively. That's what agility looks like. And that's a behavior. It's not a process. There's a huge amount of judgment in deciding who needs to be involved in the conversation, what kinds of conversations to have, and getting the decision made. Those are behaviors, not processes. So, some key points are that resolving this unexpected issue, which is a normal situation, occurred outside of process, and resulted from the behavior of individuals, not process. Agility arose from behavior, not from processes. Agility cuts across process. It goes outside of process. It's an exception to process. It's not from process. And so this situation in large companies where you have lots of products and there are shared components and issues that impact other things, that phenomenon of an issue affecting lots of things, that's normal. That's very common. And if we cannot be agile in that situation, we're not agile at all. Agility is the ability to deal with cross-cutting issues that cut across process boundaries as they arise, not waiting for the next planning increment, but as they arise. And agility is conversation-based because, as we saw, it was about identifying who needed to be involved in the conversation. And it took many minds to decide that. Just one developer probably won't know everybody who needs to be involved. What is the full scope of the impact of that issue? They might not know. So, and they might not be the final decision maker because the decision might have a big impact. So it's very possible that someone in a more leadership role needs to make a final decision. It depends. But in any case, it's conversation-based. And this is what you see in highly agile organizations. And I know Elon Musk has been in the news lately in various kind of political discussions, and this has nothing to do with that. We could not care less what his politics are. This is about leadership patterns. And at SpaceX, which we've studied, we don't study Tesla, we've studied SpaceX very extensively and talked to people who work there. And at that organization, it's everything's conversation-based. It's not process-based. They have processes. The closer they get to flight certifying something, the more process they add. But early in the development, they have almost no process. So they change their process depending on the situation. They don't have a fixed process. It's always about conversation, issues that come up, and looking at whether they've achieved creating a certain capability and how much they can push that farther, and what are the issues, what are the things in the way, and what are the ways of getting around the problems. So it's problem solving. I'm going to make my speaker really loud so that you can hear, because I think it has to go from my speaker into the mic. This gentleman, his name is Dan Rasky, and he's a scientist. He works at NASA, and he also co-founded a NASA organization called the Space Portal, which is a liaison between NASA and space startups. And he was very instrumental in SpaceX getting a crucial contract at a point in their existence where they really needed one a long time ago. But he also, because he's a world-renowned expert in spacecraft heat shields, he spent a year working at SpaceX doing a tech transfer, helping them develop the heat shield for the Dragon space capsule, which has been carrying people to the space station. And so this is an interview. I did a series of interviews with him. And this is an excerpt from one of those.
And with all that going on, we had one standing meeting a week. One, okay, not 15, okay, at NASA. If we were working the same project, oh my God, we'd have a dozen standing meetings, and with maybe tens or hundreds of people in each of those meetings, and most people had to do with statusing, right? So most of the time you're sitting and listening, right? Because someone else is talking. And then you find that there's very little time for you to work on your own because you're going from one status meeting to another status meeting to another status meeting.
Yeah. And
so here at SpaceX, we have one standing meeting a week, 11 a.m. on a Wednesday. Okay, so it's in the middle of the week, so you can kind of status in the middle. And it was at 11 a.m. so that 12 And when 12 noon came along, everyone wanted to adjourn so we could go have lunch. Okay. And that was it. And that was enough.
Yeah, so that illustrates how their communication is not about process. They don't have an orchestrated type of communication where they're stand-ups and their retros and all those kinds of things. It all happens when it's needed and right then. There's no waiting.
And with all of that going on, we had.
Okay. So, so behavior is really what it's all about, but as important as it is, it's not enough. Behavior alone won't make you agile. And the reason is because of two things. One is you have to know the agility promoting patterns. For example, if you are schooled in waterfall techniques and asked, well, how do we improve quality? We have some issues. Your response will probably be, well, increase the number of checks and increase the detail of planning and design review. And so those techniques are not bad. They make sense in a lot of situations, a lot of contexts. They even make sense in spacecraft development. But there are other techniques that often make more sense that will also make you more agile and won't slow you down. And those are the lean and flow techniques. And so if depending on which those will be the tools you tend to pull out of your toolbox. So you have to have the knowledge of the lean and flow patterns. Otherwise, unless you happen to be very inspired and creative, you probably won't think to use those ideas. You would have to invent them on your own. You wouldn't have them in a toolbox. And in addition to that knowledge, there has to be a supportive culture, because agile behavior will not survive in an organization if the culture does not make it possible. For example, if you want an agile behavior where people openly share their truth ideas about things, but your organization has a competitive culture, then people will learn very quickly not to any longer share their ideas openly because it makes them vulnerable. So the culture, it has to enable the agility behaviors. Constructive agility is a roadmap for defining your own processes. It's not a process framework like pretty much every agile framework out there. It's not a set of steps, do this, set up a team to do this and these roles. It's not like that at all. There's none of that. But process is important, but you need to define your own processes. And so constructive agility helps you do that. And it's a learning journey. It's about learning these leadership models and learning these behavioral patterns and these mental tools, and learning how to define agility promoting strategies and evolve those strategies over time. And so what you do is you create your own initiative structure, and you define your own behaviors, and you promote your behaviors, and you learn how to establish a certain type of culture, and how to establish a culture of good leadership, and how to recognize what good leadership is. So creating the right culture is a foundational element of the approach. So in the course of improving, of upskilling your people in these things, in the culture, knowledge, and behavior, agility results from that. Agility results from these things. Process is not here. There's no process in this picture. You create your own process. Process is important, but you create your own for the situation. Different situations warrant different process. And you also create strategies. And there's some very important strategies that are usually needed. They're not always all needed. But like your value strategy, why would people buy your product? And product strategy, your tech strategy, how are we going to build this? That's a very important thing. There needs to be a vision for each of these things. You don't just have a product vision. You have a vision for every key strategy, and you keep adjusting it. Sometimes you might even scrap it. but you have to have a direction. You have to be intentional about all these things. And a very important one in the middle is people strategy. How are we going to grow our people? How are we going to get our people and grow them into and help them to become part of this culture and to have these behaviors and to have the skills that we need and that they want to develop? What's our strategy for making sure that people's professional growth is actually treated as a priority? What's our strategy for that? How do we make sure that what people want doesn't get subordinated all the time to whatever the project needs? What's our strategy? There isn't just one way to do that, but we need a strategy for how to address these different categories of issues. We also need to reclaim our time. A lot of organizations that quote unquote go agile discover that suddenly all their calendars are full. And the reason that happens is because, since agile is about collaboration and getting rid of handoffs, suddenly people realize that they need to be involved in everything. And so they go to each other's meetings and they go to each other's stand-ups and other meetings, and their calendars are all full. And that's a huge dysfunction. The result of that is it dumbs us down because we no longer have time to deeply discuss issues that arise unexpectedly. If an issue arises unexpectedly and there's no opening in your calendar, you say, well, I don't have time, just do whatever you think, or just tell me or ask, or I have some time a month from now, we'll talk about it then. All of those are non-starters for agility. You need to have openings in your calendar so that within a day, you can talk something through and go deep on it. And recurring meetings are the poison. All these recurring meetings, most of them are status meetings. They're meetings where people are giving updates about different levels of issues within the organization. We need a culture where people are sending information asynchronously, and we save meetings for the gold, which is discussing things through, talking things through. Sharing information should be done asynchronously. Meetings are very expensive and very valuable. We need to save meetings for when we're ready to talk it through and deepen our understanding or make a final decision. We need to move a lot of our communication, especially status sharing, to asynchronous so that we can free up people's calendars and leave openings so that they can have unexpected ad hoc discussions about real issues that arise. Constructive agility is, as I explained, it's not a framework, it's not a big map of practices or something like that. It's a learning journey that includes real things, and the things that are included are things that are kind of universal and translatable to other contexts. Leadership theory and behavioral psychology and cognitive science and operations research. Obviously it's not the entire scope of all these subject areas, but it's the parts of them that impact organizational agility. They're very important leadership models and leadership styles that have a huge impact on actual agility. There are models from behavioral psychology that are very informative with regard to understanding how people change and how organizations change. There are elements of cognitive science that inform us about how people communicate well, how they think effectively, how they focus, the diversity of how people think, and how they create. And operations research, specifically understanding critical paths and flow and a lot of the, DevOps is really a real-time risk management paradigm, and understanding how that works. And, we feel it's not like someone's funky idea. A lot of work and research went into this, and it's based on real things. And it's a learning program that includes defining your own processes, as I explained, applying what you learn along the way. And learning occurs through training, coaching, and trying things. And defining your strategies occurs through continuously observing and always reflecting on outcomes. And defining your processes occurs through applying Agile 2 patterns and applying DevOps and other lean and flow patterns. This is actually a very simplified model. This is actually the constructive agility model, a very simplified version of it. And you can see that it has the 3 pillars. It has at the top, the behaviors. At the bottom, it has the knowledge of the lean and flow patterns. And at the left, it has the culture. So the reality is that process does not give you agility. Process is the wrong place to start. You need process, but that starting with someone's process will not make you agile. It absolutely will not. You need to define your own processes informed by agility promoting behaviors and learn in the course of doing that. The learning is crucial. The learning is the most important thing of all. You know, it's the learning that gives people the understanding of the trade-offs. And just like SpaceX knows, well, at this point in development, we don't need much process. But later, when we're getting close to flight certification, then we do. Then we need to add more process. People need to have the judgment so that they can realize whether the process fits what they're doing at that time. Some challenge questions in your organization, true or false? When cross-cutting issues arise, they get discussed by the right people and resolved quickly. So if the answer is no, you're not bad. These are normal, very common dysfunctions. And of course, it's not black and white. You know, it might be a little bit, you know, or more than a little bit. But these are common dilemmas because this stuff is not easy. And that's why a set of bumper sticker maxims won't cut it. You know, this is hard. This is organizational change. This is behavioral change. It's not easy. You know, you're true or false. Your senior leadership understands DevOps ideas. Well, why is that important? That sounds very techy. Well, they don't need to be a DevOps engineer, but they need to know the basics of how the work's being done. You know, imagine, I like to use the example of a Formula One race car team. Everybody, including the team owner, knows the basics of how that car is built. They may not be an engineer and couldn't build it themselves, but if they were to look at people working, they'd know what they're doing. It's essential to understand the whole value stream enough so that you can have conversations about it, about trade-offs. True or false, you have sufficient leadership happening at the integration level. Do you just have lots of teams and they kind of just figure out what to do? Or do you have people who stand up and do the coordinating that needs to happen? Either they just self-appointed themselves or someone designated them, but it's happening. That's what matters. Leadership has to be happening, effective leadership. True or false, real users are involved in conceiving the product. Real users are actually involved in coming up with ideas for the product. We're going to have a follow-up discussion 2 weeks from now. We'll announce it. And it'll be an opportunity to actually have a live discussion about some of these things, because these are complicated things. And we are challenging some things that are kind of the status quo in the industry, even though the industry has been complaining for a long time that these older approaches don't work. But still, there's some established narratives and kind of default approaches, and we are challenging some of that. So, you know, we're going to have a live discussion about this in about 2 weeks, an open forum for discussing constructive agility and these related issues. Please attend and please invite others who you think might be interested. This is where you can find more information about constructive agility. It's our website /CA. And you probably know this is who we are, and we're pretty easy to reach, and we're in LinkedIn too. Steve,
we'd like to,
yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
we'd like to open it up now for questions. And Cliff, if you could tell us how we're going to do the magic of switching from a webinar into more of a meeting mode, the Zoom meeting mode.
We're new using the webinar feature. There doesn't seem to be a way to like magically do that.
We can also take questions in chat. So,
Cliff, I think it might work a little better if we curate questions that we find in the chat
Okay.
and have you answer them. And I'll just take the first one. I mean, you asked people what issues they were starting to see in their environments. And a number of people talked about the difficulties in communication in hybrid and remote work environments and the impacts that that was creating for some of their teams.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a challenge, and that's something that we hit square on with Agile 2 and Constructive Agility, because the key to realize, the key thing there is neurodiversity is a term that was created to describe people who are kind of on the margin neurologically, like people who are far on the autistic spectrum and or maybe have processing issues with regard to hearing or reading and things like that, dyslexia and so on. But the term is starting to be used more broadly, which I applaud, because we're all on these spectra. We all are, and the number of people who are quote unquote normal, who are in the middle of each of these spectra, they're the minority. Most people are not in the middle. Most people are a little from the middle and some, and a little farther from the middle and some others. So neurodiversity is something that we need to understand as the human reality. And the idea that we all collaborate best in a certain way is false. It's very false. We're all familiar with the categorization of introvert and extrovert, and there have been a lot of studies. Actually, the Agile 2 book references quite a number of studies about it, that so-called, based on Myers-Briggs categorization, with all its challenges, but still, introverts behave differently, and they tend to want to think on their own before they discuss, whereas extroverts tend to want to start out discussing. So we need to honor these differences, and we also need to, understand that this in-person versus remote is not like one's better than the other. There are pros and cons. Being in person does tend to favor and empower the verbal communicators, but being remote tends to favor and empower the written communicators. So, but the thing is, we're becoming a global world. The work world is going global. And so we kind of cannot escape the shift to more remote, because teams now are starting to become far separated, where they cannot come together. The Agile 2 team of 15 people was a global team. We couldn't even meet in person if we wanted to. So it's just the reality. We have to make the best of it. And there are some real advantages to remote collaboration, to asynchronous work. There's some disadvantages too. So we need to see the glass half full, and we need to make the best of the situation. And some organizations, there was an article in the New York Times the other day about how a lot of companies that have headquarters in New York City are now creating satellite offices in like Queens and other suburbs, so that people don't have to commute in anymore, because no one wants to commute anymore. It's a messy, complicated issue. I think we just have to be tolerant and try. The goal is to communicate.
So, Cliff, there's not a question, but a statement here that's kind of interesting, and I think maybe you could respond to. It's from June, and it says, strategy and culture don't align because one is shaped by the future and the other is forged by the past.
Well, that's why we need to continuously be adjusting strategy. You know, the old approach of creating like a 5-year plan and fixed strategy is just dead in the water. You know, strategy needs to be something that you're always adjusting, that you're always thinking about it, not something that once a year you get together and do strategy. Strategy needs to always be top of mind. We need to be event-based, you know, so that, you know, if, you know, whenever things happen, we have new information, we need to be thinking, does that impact our strategy? You know, yes, it might have a tactical impact, but does it have a strategic impact too? And if it does, reconvene, you know, restart the conversation. Strategy needs to move from something that we do on a cadence to something that we do in an ongoing basis where we're always addressing strategy, always thinking both short-term and long-term.
There's another statement in here probably that it would be good to hear something from you on, which is from somebody named Jen, who basically says, don't overlook the need for some process. Operationalizing an organization requires some documentation. That said, it should focus on limiting it to what's most relevant.
Yes, process is essential. You just don't want to start with process. And sometimes you have to start with some process. You know, if there are regulations and safety concerns, you put process in and you're smart about it. But starting with a process with the goal of agility, that's the wrong place to start. You know, I use the example of SpaceX because we've learned a lot about how they work. And I mentioned that they have process, but the amount of process they have increases the closer you get to flight certification. You know, so process is absolutely crucial, but you need the minimum process at any point that makes sense for that situation. You don't want more process than you actually need, given the kinds of risks that you're dealing with for that activity at that time.
Cliff, let me ask a question that I know several participants in this have talked to me about, and that's how do you change a culture in the organization where stand-up meetings are the norm and people aren't being able to get their job done and they don't have time to think?
Well, you know, the thing to do is, you know, first you want to kind of make the case, you want to collect evidence. So ask them, you know, do some kind of, you know, formal or informal survey and collect some information. How many people feel the stand up is an effective way for them to do whatever it's supposed to do? You know, and if half of them say yes and half of them no, that's a problem because half is a lot. You know, the whole point of a stand-up is to sync up everybody, you know, but there are other ways to do that. So, you know, a major focus of Agile 2 is individual agency. And that was the intent of the Agile Manifesto, I believe, you know, about trust the team to get the job done. It was really, I believe, about individual agency, but it was kind of phrased wrong. It was phrased like, you know, like leave the team alone. Like it was kind of anti-manager, which makes no sense. You absolutely need managers. You know, a manager by definition is someone in a leadership role who has some kind of accountability and authority to make a category of decisions. It might be people decisions, it might be deployment decisions, it might be resource spend decisions. But a manager is someone who has positional authority over some set of decisions, types of decisions. So you need that, you know, just for a fiduciary accountability at a minimum. You know, so how can you do without managers? You absolutely need managers. But you know, you know, it's a situation, you know, where you know, you want to make sure you're achieving the purpose. You know, if the purpose is to sync up, there are other ways to do that, and you know, give people agency about what they think would work for them at that point in time. You know, don't lock it in so it's like that they had their chance, you decided now that's what you're going to live with forever. You know, you should always be revisiting your processes. You know, I longed a long time ago in my career, I was on a team where suddenly there were a lot of bugs about mid during development. And we started having an afternoon meeting at 3 o'clock every day for an hour to talk through the source of the bugs technically. And boy, did that have a huge impact. After a month, we realized no more, bugs have pretty much gone. We don't need that anymore. So we created that recurring meeting when we needed it, and then as soon as we didn't need it, we got rid of it. So that's what people need to do. Always be reflecting on their process and adjusting based on what they think they need. They have agency, they're in control, they know why they're doing these things. It gives them a higher feeling of responsibility for things.
I see a statement in here that I also think should maybe trigger something for you to respond to. There's some discussion about companies bringing consultants in who are really not agile, and it brings to my mind the notion of how do you perpetuate your culture, especially when a lot of the people that might be working on various and sundry of your initiatives aren't around full time, or maybe are there for the short term?
Well, there are a whole bunch of issues there that you just mentioned. I mean, part-time versus long-term, are two different things. And, I think it's an illusion to kind of see like contractors and permanent employees as sort of different in their longevity, at least in the tech field. That's changed a lot. People change jobs pretty frequently in tech, whether they're employee or contractor. It doesn't really matter. And, if half of your workforce, the people doing product development are contractors, they need to be empowered. I mean, you need to be listening to them. They need to have some say about things. Otherwise you have a disenfranchised, 50% of your workforce that feels vulnerable and that feels like they have no say about anything. So we need to look at contractors differently, at least in product development context. I think, what was the other issue that you mentioned? I mean, you mentioned three things, and two of them were part-time, versus long-term. Part-time, I don't know what the concern is there.
Well, it's just that there are people that have a short-term attitude.
Okay.
But the other side is also, there are people that come in and need to integrate themselves in an existing culture.
Yeah.
So the issue is, assuming that everybody does want to be constructive about it, what are the things that we should point people to do to help, inculcate and perpetuate the culture with these folks?
Yeah, well, it's a huge mistake to assume that contractors don't care about the organization, that they're mercenaries. I've worked as a contractor for a large part of my career, either as a consultant or a contractor. And it's so not true. Contractors, I know, to them, it's a job. It's the only difference is they don't have they have a 1099 instead of a W-2. That's the only difference in their mind. Really, it's the only difference in their head. And they usually do care, because it's kind of why they have that job. They like it. They want to have an impact. It's like, that's what makes it interesting. So to assume that contractors are mercenaries is, at least in tech field, is just so wrong. It's not true. With regard to culture, the only way to change culture is to be senior leadership needs to be very aggressive about it. They need to advocate, they need to evangelize, and they need to walk the talk. They need to change incentives. It's a whole program. They need to be intentional. One of the strategies was about culture, and they need to think about intentionally, what kind of culture do we want? And they need to strategize about that, and they need to see it through. It's long-term. You can change your culture. It takes time, and you need to focus on what really matters, not try and change everything. but you can have a huge impact on your culture if you go the distance, and it's crucial to do so.
So in the interest of time, we're getting up to our hour. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming and participating. We've had a lot of interesting questions and things that have come up here. We will be sending out a link to the tape of this meeting, this webinar that we have, but also sending out an invitation in a few weeks to more of a discussion around some of these issues. And there was also some talk about leadership, and we are in the process of designing some constructive agility leadership training programs, because we realize that everything in terms of the success is based upon the leadership. It's a critical factor, and they need to be trained, and they need to understand what this is and how to change their behaviors. So.
Thank you, everybody. As Stephen said, we'll be posting this, and we will post the chat session too, assuming everything in it is postable. I haven't looked at it all. Never know. We hope this was beneficial. Thank you.